back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of 1968. In the last few lectures, we talked about Mexico in 1968, focusing on the student protests and the disastrous massacre in Tlatelolco that ended those protests. In the lectures to follow, we'll be talking about the Olympics in 1968, returning to Mexico for part of that discussion, but also focusing on some of the broader issues affecting black athletes throughout the world and particularly in the United States in 1968. As described briefly in the previous lectures, the Mexico City Olympics were shrouded in a number of different controversies. One of those that rose to the forefront in the mid to late 1960s was the issue of South Africa and its participation in the Olympics. There had been a long-standing ideal associated with the Olympics that politics and sport must not mix. And so for the most part, Olympic organizers attempted to remain above and removed from political issues, although to some degree or another, politics and sport and the Olympics have always been intertwined. But the issues involving South Africa became particularly complex and difficult in the mid-1960s. South Africa was governed by the fiercely racist policy of apartheid, which denied blacks many rights throughout South Africa and certainly affected their athletic participation and therefore the fairness of their Olympic team. So, while the International Olympic Committee, the organizers of the Olympics, had always talked about keeping sport and politics separate, they did have rules associated with the fairness of the qualification process. And so a sort of equality or fairness within each nation's athletic system was expected. And so South Africa appealed for admission to the Olympics in 1964 and was denied, not directly because of apartheid, but because those sporting policies in the country made conditions unfair for blacks. Blacks and whites generally could not participate on the same fields or in the same arenas or swim in the same pools or compete in the same boxing ring. They couldn't room together. They couldn't travel together. They couldn't eat together. Spectators at events in South Africa were segregated as well. So how could one expect their sports and Olympic teams to be fairly selected under those conditions? So while South Africa appealed to compete in the Olympics in 1963, the International Olympic Committee suspended South Africa, announcing that they would not be allowed to participate in 1964. But they appealed again for admission to the 1968 Olympics, and they began to institute some changes to their system that they hoped would be sufficient to convince the IOC to allow them to compete. They announced that they would form one integrated team of both black and white athletes, that they would be allowed to travel together and house together and eat together and all of these sorts of things. They would march under one flag as one team. And so they appealed for admission to the Olympics, and in September of 1967, the IOC sent a group to South Africa to investigate conditions there to decide if South Africa should be reinstated. What this committee found was that while some changes had been implemented, the system was still not perfect. They still did not allow black and white competitors to compete against each other on the same field within South Africa. And the qualification process and Olympic trials were segregated, so black and whites qualified separately. The most troubling issue involved just the overall sporting infrastructure in South Africa, which still remained completely segregated, and facilities and access to training and other equipment were far inferior for black athletes if they were allowed any kind of access at all. These issues were particularly brought to light when one of the celebrated South African cricketers, Basil de Oliveira, was so disappointed with the equipment and facilities available to black players in South Africa that he moved to England, where he became one of the biggest stars in the world. And so this really brought new light to the unfairness of the system in South Africa. At the same time, Olympic leadership again determined to rule that politics and sport didn't mix. In a very contested discussion and vote in February of 1968, voted in favor of readmitting South Africa to compete in 1968 in Mexico City. Obviously, this was a hugely controversial decision. Even those who voted for it conceded that there were still issues to be resolved in South Africa, but in part they hoped that admission to the Olympics would inspire further changes within the country and within the system. But immediately in the aftermath of that decision, a worldwide boycott movement erupted. There were conversations in sporting bodies all over the world, and many nations, particularly the black African nations, the other nations in Africa, announced that they would not compete as long as South Africa was allowed to compete in the Olympics. And within just a few weeks, this amounted to the entirety of Africa, except for South Africa itself, boycotting the Olympics. The movement began to spread to other parts of the world. The Middle East and others began to join the movement. And the Soviet Union and many of its supporting nations at least suggested that they might boycott the Mexico City Olympics if South Africa was allowed to compete. And so this became an enormous worldwide movement that led to a lot of pressure on the IOC and really threatened the existence of these Olympics at all. Caught in the middle within this controversy were black athletes in South Africa who had celebrated the readmission of the Olympic team in that moment. One newspaper in South Africa wrote, "The Olympic movement has succeeded where no one else ever succeeded before, namely to cause a first crack in the monolithic block of apartheid policy. For the first time, the South African government has publicly admitted that non-whites also are South African citizens." And yet, as the boycott movement swelled, coming to incorporate dozens of nations around the world, and as African American athletes also began to protest and threaten to boycott, which we'll talk about shortly, the pressure on the International Olympic Committee to reinstall the ban of South Africa became too great. And in a vote on April 21st, 1968, the IOC did indeed revoke the invitation to South Africa. And so South Africa was once again banned. The issue of sport and apartheid in South Africa would continue to fester for years and would be revived in Olympic circles numerous times. But those are issues for another lecture in another course down the road. For our purposes, I want to focus on the fact that the issue of South Africa and apartheid and this worldwide boycott movement had also drawn in African American athletes and in many ways sparked a boycott movement within the United States that had already been growing among black athletes. And so that's where we'll turn next in this discussion. Black athletes in America had long had their own set of complaints and issues, and while perhaps not quite as extreme as apartheid policies in South Africa, American Jim Crow policies significantly limited opportunities available to black athletes. Now, those barriers had begun tumbling down in the United States, particularly in the aftermath of World War II and as the American Civil Rights Movement began to gain steam in the 1950s and into the 60s. Jackie Robinson's signing by the Brooklyn Dodgers and breaking the Major League Baseball color barrier in 1947 was seen as a momentous event, not only in the world of sports, but in the country in general. Now, what followed Jackie Robinson was not this massive tidal wave of signings of black athletes into the professional ranks of sports, but more of a trickle. And so the changes that were perceived in the signing of Jackie Robinson in many ways didn't bring material change to many black athletes around the country who still confronted many barriers and challenges, contending in a world of sport that was completely dominated and controlled by white coaches and owners and administrators. While Jackie Robinson and some of the other early pioneers gave African Americans hope and inspiration and appeared to signal barriers coming down, the vast majority of black athletes continued to toil in systems where their opportunities were significantly limited. In the age of desegregation following World War II, white-dominated colleges all over the country began admitting black students. And many of those early black students were athletes, meaning that not only were they breaking down barriers on campuses as students, but they were also breaking down barriers as athletes, the first black athletes on those various teams. And so we start to see a sort of Jackie Robinson movement on every team, at every level, every school, every college, every professional team around the country. There are those first black athletes all over the place. And so for these first black athletes on college campuses, they found their opportunities limited. And first and foremost, they were among a very small number of black students on the campuses. And so they were kind of surrounded by a white-dominated system. They had a lot of social difficulties on campuses where they were isolated and ostracized. There were academic challenges. Either they were treated unfairly at times by professors, or they were kind of ushered into empty and easy courses to make sure that they would be eligible to compete in athletics. And in general, black athletes at white-dominated colleges found it difficult to fit in, to blend in, to interact socially on the campus at the same time that they were going through all of the athletic challenges that every other athlete was going through. Those black athletes who attempted to break barriers at the professional level confronted similar kinds of challenges as well. The stereotype, very common at that time, was that black athletes were physically gifted but mentally deficient. And so in many cases they were shuttled into particular positions on the team that usually involved less decision-making and less control of the action and more athleticism on the field. So for instance, for the sport of football, there were no black quarterbacks in this era. They were ushered into positions like defensive backs on the defense or wide receiver on the offense, farther away from the ball, but requiring athletic skills. This also meant that they tended to be stacked into certain positions. So on a football team, you might only have 2 or 3 black players, and they were all wide receivers, or they were all running backs, or something like that. So they really didn't have that many opportunities for more black athletes to get on the field. In previous lectures in this course, I talked about the civil rights movement, the assassination of Martin Luther King, and the kind of shifting emphasis within the movement in the mid to late 1960s. And so it's important to remember that black athletes were also black human beings and black citizens in the United States. And so they were kind of buffeted by the same changes and thoughts and controversies that all African Americans were during this time. And like every other citizen, they developed their own opinions, their own thoughts, and their own beliefs as far as what the best course of action would be. And so black athletes, like everyone else, were divided in their opinions as the civil rights movement shifted in the mid to late 1960s. Athletes, though, do tend to draw more publicity than other citizens in many cases. And so a very prominent athlete like Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, drew a great deal of attention. And Ali joined the Black Muslim movement during this period and became very outspoken in that realm. In April of 1968, Ali refused induction into the Army when he was drafted by the Army. The induction officer repeatedly called him Cassius Clay, which was the name that he had changed years prior. Ali refused induction, saying, "I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and kill and burn a poor nation simply to help continue the domination of white slave masters over the darker people." For this protest, Ali was stripped of his heavyweight title and sentenced to 5 years in prison, although he never served that time, although it took years for him to clear his name and be able to box again. And he essentially became a martyr for the cause of black athletes during this time. So a growing number of African American athletes began to support the Black Power movement, which I talked about earlier in the course. And they became associated with this more militant brand of protest by the late 1960s. We're going to talk about a number of different athletes, but I'll mention some of the words of Tommy Smith, one of the great sprinters who's involved in the Olympic protest we'll be talking about. He said, "As far as being spit on, being stepped on, being bitten by dogs, the first dog that bites me, I'm going to bite back. We're not going to wait for the white man to think of something else to do against us." In the next lecture, we'll talk about how this growing militant among black American athletes began to blossom into a movement which ultimately came to incorporate a possible boycott of the 1968 Olympics.